Malcolm Reeves was 41 years old when his ex-wife stood on the front porch of the house on Doverfield Lane and told him she never wanted to see his face at this address again. She said it with her arms crossed and her voice carrying the particular certainty of a woman who had decided she was in possession of something she could not be removed from. The house was a 4-bedroom Craftsman in a suburb of Atlanta, Georgia, that Danielle had moved into 7 months after their divorce was finalized, with a man named Victor Stokes, who sold commercial insurance and drove a white BMW and had, according to the 3 people who had mentioned him to Malcolm, without being asked, a way of presenting himself in rooms that suggested he had confused the impression of solidity with solidity itself. Malcolm had driven out that Sunday afternoon to drop off the last box of Danielle's belongings that had been in storage at his mother's house: coats, kitchen items, a framed photograph she had asked for twice. He had parked at the curb. He had carried the box to the porch. She had opened the door before he knocked and had said what she said. He had set the box down on the top porch step without placing it inside the door. He had looked at her for a moment with the even attention of a man who processes information before he responds to it. He had said, "All right." He had walked back to his truck and driven home. What Danielle did not know, what she had built her certainty around not knowing, was that Malcolm Reeves held the mortgage on that house. Not as a guarantor, not as a co-signer, as the primary lender of record on a private mortgage he had issued through an LLC he had formed for exactly this kind of transaction. After the original lender had sold the loan as part of a portfolio disposition 8 months earlier, and Malcolm had purchased it through a competitive bid process at a discount that reflected the market's assessment of the loan's complexity and his own assessment of its value. He had known the address when he saw it in the portfolio. He had known the address for the same reason most men know the address their ex-wife is living at, which was not surveillance, but simple awareness. The kind that accumulates over time when you share a life with someone and then stop sharing it, and the city is not so large that the information stops arriving. He had purchased the loan. He had said nothing. He had driven out with a box of coats and kitchen items on a Sunday afternoon and had been told to never step foot in that house again. He had driven home and had called his attorney. What happened next would be a lesson in whose name was actually at the top of the paperwork. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. Malcolm Reeves had grown up in East Atlanta, in a house on Glenwood Avenue that his grandmother Odessa had owned since 1977, purchased the year she turned 40 with the accumulated savings of 12 years of nursing and one carefully managed insurance settlement, and the specific determination of a woman who had decided that owning the place you lived was not a luxury, but a prerequisite for the kind of stability she intended to provide for the people who depended on her. Odessa was 79 years old now and still in the house on Glenwood Avenue, still tending the garden along the south fence with the same patient attention she had brought to it for 40 years. She had outlasted 3 neighbors, 2 city council members she had opinions about, and 1 major road widening that had taken a piece of the front yard she had never quite forgiven. She attended the same church she had attended since 1974 and sat in the same pew and had strong and specific views on most things and shared them without apology, and had been right often enough that people had long since stopped arguing and started listening. Malcolm had inherited from Odessa, not the house that was going to his mother's sister, but the method. The method was: understand the thing you are dealing with more completely than anyone else in the room. Prepare more thoroughly than the situation appears to require, and never announce what you have until the announcement serves a purpose. He had applied this method to his work as a real estate investment analyst for a private equity firm in Atlanta's Buckhead corridor. where he had spent 12 years developing the specific expertise that allowed him to assess the value of complex real estate assets, distressed mortgages, underperforming portfolios, properties with encumbered title, with the kind of precision that separated the investors who made money from the ones who made noise. He was good at his work. He was consistently good at it. His firm's partners had noted this without ceremony, which was how he preferred things noted. The expertise had come from the work itself, as it always did when the work was done with full attention. He had read the market the way Odessa read her garden, not from the surface but from the conditions, the underlying health, the difference between what something looked like and what it was capable of becoming with correct management. He had spent 12 years developing the vocabulary of that reading, and he had spent the preceding 3 years applying it to his own portfolio through the LLC, which had provided him with a set of private investment positions that operated entirely outside his professional identity, and that had, in their quiet and undeclared way, been building a foundation under his life that most people in that life had no knowledge of and no reason to suspect. He had started the LLC 3 years ago at the recommendation of his financial advisor, a woman named Clara Hutchins, who had observed that several of the investment opportunities Malcolm identified in the course of his professional work were available to him on a personal basis, and that the absence of a vehicle for pursuing them was not a principled position, but an oversight. Clara was 54 years old and had been advising private clients in Atlanta for 23 years, with the organized calm of someone who had seen enough financial decisions made from emotion to have developed a strong and abiding preference for decisions made from analysis. She had set up the LLC with the specificity of someone who understood that the entity's structure would matter before any of its activities did. And she had been right, as she typically was, in the ways that counted. The mortgage portfolio had come to Malcolm's attention through a correspondent at a secondary mortgage market firm who knew Malcolm's acquisition criteria and who had forwarded the portfolio listing in September as a matter of professional courtesy. The portfolio contained 11 loans on residential properties across the Atlanta metropolitan area in various states of performance. Malcolm had reviewed all 11. 7 had not interested him for reasons of collateral quality or loan-to-value ratios that did not support his return requirements. 3 had interested him as a group. 1 had interested him additionally because of its address. He had considered, for approximately 45 minutes, whether purchasing a mortgage on the property where his ex-wife lived was the kind of decision a man of correct judgment made. He had concluded, after those 45 minutes, that it was a financial asset that met his acquisition criteria, and that the personal dimension of it was an incidental fact rather than a driving motivation. He had discussed it with Clara, who had said, "You need to be certain you can manage it professionally regardless of what happens between the parties." He had said, "Yes." She had said, "Then, the analysis is the analysis." He had purchased the 3 loan package, of which the Doverfield Lane property was one, for a combined price of $412,000, representing a discount to face value that reflected both the portfolio's complexity and Malcolm's accurate assessment of its underlying quality. He had not told Danielle. There was no legal requirement to do so. The loan servicer had sent the standard notice of transfer of servicing rights to the borrower of record, which was Victor Stokes, at the property address. Victor Stokes had received the notice. Victor Stokes had apparently filed it without understanding its significance. Malcolm had met Danielle in 2015 at a real estate networking event in Buckhead, which was the kind of event he attended because his firm encouraged it, and which he generally found more useful for ambient market intelligence than for direct business development. She had been working in property management then, and had asked him a question about cap rate compression in the in-town submarket that had demonstrated she had a working knowledge of the field rather than a tourist's familiarity with its vocabulary. He had liked the question. He had been careful with her in the way he was careful with everything he thought might be worth the care. Deliberate, attentive, without the urgency that compressed evaluation. They had been married for 4 years. The divorce had been finalized 2 years before the Sunday afternoon on the porch. He had not sought it and had not resisted it when it became clear that Danielle's investment in the marriage had been redirecting itself for the better part of a year toward a version of her life that did not have him in it. He had processed this with the precision and patience he brought to most things that required processing, which was to say he had given it the time it required and had not given it more than that. What he had felt, standing at the curb in front of the Doverfield Lane house that Sunday afternoon with a box of coats and kitchen items, was not anger. Anger was a response that assumed the other party's opinion of the situation was relevant to its resolution. What he had felt was something closer to clarification. The specific quality of understanding that arrives when something you have known intellectually is confirmed in a form that makes the knowing complete. He had set the box on the porch step. He had driven home. He had called his attorney. His attorney was a man named Lawrence Brains, who practiced civil and real estate law from an office in Decatur, with the organized precision of someone who had spent 26 years in property transactions and who had developed, through that exposure, a complete and unromantic understanding of what documentation could and could not accomplish, and when each variety was appropriate. Lawrence had reviewed the mortgage documentation, the portfolio acquisition records, and the servicing transfer notice when Malcolm had first brought him the Doverfield Lane acquisition. Not because Malcolm anticipated the Sunday afternoon exchange, but because Lawrence reviewed all of Malcolm's real estate transactions as a matter of course. Because that was the correct way to manage a portfolio. He had noted then that the transaction was clean and correctly structured. When Malcolm called him after the Sunday afternoon exchange, Lawrence had listened to the account and had been quiet for a moment, and had then said, "You understand that none of this changes the loan's terms or your rights under it." Malcolm had said, "I know." Lawrence had said, "And you understand that there are correct and incorrect ways to proceed." Malcolm had said, "Tell me the correct ways." Lawrence had told him. He had taken notes. Clara Hutchins had come to Malcolm's office the following Wednesday morning with a full summary of the 3 loan portfolio's current performance and a forward analysis of the Doverfield Lane loan specifically. Payment history, remaining term, current loan-to-value given the most recent comparable sales in the submarket, and 3 scenarios for the loan's resolution depending on the borrower's behavior over the next 12 months. She set the summary on his desk and said, "I want you to look at this as an asset and not as anything else." He had looked at it as an asset. The loan was performing. Payments had been on time through the 6 months since acquisition. The asset was sound. The situation was not. He had driven to Odessa's house the Saturday after the Sunday afternoon exchange and had sat with her in the kitchen while she made the tea she made every Saturday morning, regardless of visitors, because the tea was not for visitors but for herself, and visitors were welcome to join. He had told her the full account. She had listened without interrupting, which was her way when the subject was serious. When he finished, she had poured his tea and set it in front of him, and had been quiet for a long moment. She looked at the window above the sink. "Your grandfather Calvin," she said, "used to say that the most dangerous position in any transaction is the one where you think you know more than you do about the other party's situation." She turned back to her cup. He was talking about business. He meant it about people, too. She drank. "That woman stood on the porch of a house and told the man who holds the note on it to stay away from it," She set the cup down with the deliberate care of someone placing a period at the end of a sentence. She didn't know what she was standing on. She looked at him. "You do. Act accordingly. Act correctly. Let the paperwork speak." Lawrence Baines had sent the formal notice of default 6 weeks after the Sunday afternoon exchange. Not because Malcolm had engineered a default. Because Victor Stokes had missed the October payment, and the November payment had been partial, and the terms of the note were the terms of the note, and the terms required notice. The notice was sent to the borrower of record at the property address, by certified mail, as required. It was signed by Lawrence on behalf of Eastgate Mortgage Holdings, LLC. It was accurate and procedurally correct in every particular. Victor Stokes had received the notice and had apparently not understood, until that moment, what the transfer of servicing rights letter he had filed without reading had meant. He had made 2 calls. The first was to the loan servicer, who had confirmed that the loan had been sold and that the holder of record was Eastgate Mortgage Holdings, ALC. The second call, according to what Danielle would later tell her own attorney, had been a longer call, during which he had explained the situation, and she had understood, in the particular and comprehensive way that certain kinds of understanding arrive, all at once, with full implications, whose name was on the paperwork she had told to stay away from her address. Danielle had retained an attorney named Patricia Webb, who was competent and professional, and who had reviewed the loan documentation with the systematic attention of someone who was looking for an argument that did not exist. She had taken 3 days with the documentation. She had made 2 calls to colleagues in real estate law whose opinions she trusted. She had arrived at the same conclusion that competent analysis of that documentation would always arrive at. The loan was valid. The acquisition had been arm's length. The transfer of servicing rights had been properly noticed to the borrower of record at the time of transfer, which was 8 months before the Sunday afternoon porch exchange, which meant the notice had been sitting in Victor Stokes's files or recycling bin for 8 months while Danielle stood on a porch and told the note holder to never come back. The default was documented, correctly triggered, and supported by 61 days of payment history that did not require interpretation. There was no basis on which to challenge the note's validity, Malcolm's standing as holder of record, or the technical accuracy of the default notice in any of its particulars. Patricia Webb had called Lawrence Baines on a Wednesday morning, and they had spoken with the professional efficiency of 2 attorneys who understood the shape of the situation and had no interest in performing a dispute they both knew the outcome of. They had discussed a resolution. Lawrence had brought the resolution to Malcolm. The resolution was a refinance. Victor Stokes and Danielle would refinance the Doverfield Lane property with a conventional lender, paying off Malcolm's note at its face value, plus the appropriate accrued interest, and the documented default fees, which under the terms of the note were not punitive, but were real and were owed. The face value of the note was $308,000. The accrued interest and fees came to $11,000. Malcolm would receive $319,000 in full satisfaction of the note. Against his acquisition cost, this represented a return that Clara had calculated, in a summary she delivered without ceremony, as appropriate for the holding period and the risk profile. Malcolm had sat across from Lawrence at the signing table on a Thursday morning in January, and had reviewed the payoff documents with the same attention he brought to every document he signed, which was complete and unhurried. He had signed. He had nodded to Lawrence. He had left the office and had driven to his next appointment, which was a meeting with Clara about 2 additional loan acquisitions she had identified that fit his criteria. He had not thought about Doverfield Lane on the drive. He had thought about the loan-to-value ratios on the two new acquisitions and whether the collateral quality justified the discount at which they were being offered, which was what the situation in front of him required him to think about, and which was therefore what he thought about. He had not been angry at Danielle. He did not consider her an adversary. He considered her a person who had made a series of decisions based on an incomplete understanding of the financial architecture of her own situation, which was a common condition and not a moral failing, and which had resolved itself through the correct application of the appropriate legal and financial instruments, which was how most things resolved when handled correctly. 11 months after the payoff, Malcolm was in Odessa's garden on a Saturday afternoon in October, helping her stake the late-season dahlias she had planted along the south fence in June and which had grown past their own capacity to stand upright, which was a problem that required the modest intervention of a stake and some twine and the willingness to spend a Saturday afternoon in a garden with an 80-year-old woman who had opinions about dahlia cultivation that she delivered with the same authority she delivered everything. The dahlias were deep red and slightly overblown with the extravagance of late-season bloom, and the October light caught them at an angle that made the garden look, for a moment, like something permanent. Which it was, in the way that things cared for consistently over decades become permanent. His personal financial picture had changed in the preceding year in ways that Clara had projected, and that had arrived, as her projections tended to arrive within the range she had specified. The 3-loan portfolio had returned 22% on his acquisition cost across all 3 positions, which was the kind of return that confirmed a thesis rather than surprising it. He had deployed the proceeds into 2 additional acquisitions and was in due diligence on a third. The LLC had a track record now, a short one, but clean, documented, and defensible, which was the foundation on which longer track records were built. He was building the longer one. His work at the firm continued with the same consistency it had always had. The partners had noted his performance in the annual review with the same unadorned accuracy they brought to all evaluations, which was that his acquisition analysis had been correct in 15 of the 17 positions he had evaluated in the preceding fiscal year, with the 2 outliers attributable to market conditions that no analysis could have fully anticipated, which was an acceptable miss rate for the asset class and better than the industry average by a margin that the senior partner had noted and moved on from without elaboration, which was the highest form of compliment available in that office. He had been offered a partnership discussion 2 months prior and had declined to have it yet, not because he was uninterested, but because the LLC's independent trajectory was at a stage where it deserved his full attention before he introduced any variable that might complicate it. This was the kind of decision that looked like patience from the outside and was, from the inside, simply correct sequencing. Imani Locke was a real estate attorney he had known professionally for 4 years and had begun seeing socially 8 months ago, which had been her suggestion rather than his, and which he had agreed to because she was specific and direct and had, the first time she had challenged one of his analytical positions in a professional setting, been correct, which was a quality he valued beyond most others in a person and found, in his experience, genuinely rare. She practiced transactional real estate law from an office in Midtown and had the organized precision of someone who had spent 12 years working with documentation that was either correct or consequentially wrong, with nothing in between, and who had developed as a result an allergy to imprecision that Malcolm found not just acceptable, but actively appealing. She asked real questions. She did not ask them in order to have asked them. She asked them because she wanted the answers, and she listened to the answers with the full attention of someone who had decided that her time was valuable enough to warrant actually using it. She had a quality of presence, When she was in a room that was neither performance nor assertion, it was simply the natural result of someone who had been paying careful attention for long enough that paying careful attention had become their default mode. He had noticed this the first time they met, and had continued to notice it since, which was its own form of information. She was not at Odessa's house this Saturday. She had a family commitment in Savannah. She would be back Monday. He had talked to her Thursday evening for 45 minutes, and had found the 45 minutes useful, which was how he found most time he spent with people who paid real attention to things. Odessa straightened up from the dahlia bed and looked at what they had done. The stakes were straight. The twine was correct. The dahlias had what they needed without having more than they needed, which was the correct relationship between support and growth, in Odessa's view and in Malcolm's. "Your grandfather Calvin," Odessa said, not for the first time, and not in a way that suggested repetition, diminished the point, "bought this house in 1977 for $62,000, and everybody on this street thought he had overpaid." She picked up her gardening gloves and began pulling them off one finger at a time. They were working with what was visible. He was working with what he understood. She folded the gloves and tucked them into her apron pocket. 47 years later, this house is worth what it is worth, and those people are long since gone. She looked at the dahlias. Understanding the asset is the work. Everything else is procedure. She walked back toward the house. Malcolm followed. The garden held the afternoon light. The dahlias stood straight in the correct proportion of support and freedom, blooming past the point that most people would have expected, into the season that belonged to the patient and the correctly prepared. He had built what he had built. It was documented, valued, and his. It would continue to be, because he had built it on a foundation that did not require announcement, only maintenance and the passage of time. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.